is a model that has been developing for about 30 years. It's a model that we actually teach at a trauma center that we have at Divine Mercy. And let me also say that this model is very loosely built on the work of David Seamands, who was a missionary and wrote 2 books in the early and mid 80s called Healing for Damaged Emotions and Healing of the Memories. And with Dr. Seamands, the model has taken quite a few turns along the way. One last caveat is that this is a model that is not linear, it's circular. So you may be working at level 2 one day and level 9 the next day, and it'll just sort of wrap around itself back and forth. This is a model that was developed to work predominantly with sexual trauma survivors across the what we call the dissociative spectrum of trauma. The dissociative spectrum includes the diagnoses of borderline personality disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, dissociative disorder, and dissociative identity disorder. So we'll be talking about them as we go along a little bit. This is a model that follows a standardized 3-phase model of treatment that is recognized by the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation, and I'll be talking about those 3 phases in just a minute. The stages, though, fit into those 3 phases, and it is designed as an overlay model. What I mean by overlay model is that we work very much with the secular model and the steps that are involved in working with trauma, and we put a Christian overlay to it to address and to deal with faith-based issues. So, the 3 phases. The initial phase of trauma when you're working with this is a time of rapport building, safety issues, confidentiality, crisis stabilization, orientation to the therapeutic process, boundary issues. And if you're dealing with DID, it's system mapping, basically getting to know the different parts and the different alters within the system. You know, something interesting about parts is that if you understand alters and parts and so forth, particularly the work of Jack and Helen Watkins with ego state therapy, you begin to understand that we're all sort of parts, if you will. We have different emotions. We have different parts of us that relate to different ages and different places where we are. Phase 1 can take easily 6 months if you do this well with a client. It's capacity building. It's getting them prepared to do deeper work with trauma. I think one of the things that I am starting to really emphasize when I do supervision with counselors is to really emphasize the need of capacity building with clients that have been traumatized. Getting them ready to be able to withstand the emotions, being able to self-regulate. Marshall Linehan's dialectical behavioral skills have really been a godsend in a way to work with these kind of clients. Most of us have heard the term mindfulness. It shows up in a lot of different places in a lot of different ways. 40 years ago, we called it Gestalt therapy. Yeah, it's starting to set in, that's good. But it's doing all the preliminary things before the process, before we move into phase 2, which deals with uncovering and dealing with the memory. It's processing all the feelings, the cognitive restructuring that needs to go on, fusion, some integration, most of the therapy work that's around memory, affect regulation, cognitive distortion, and stabilization happens in this second phase. And then the third phase, of course, with DID, you deal with the final integration, the final parts coming together, relearning to live as a single personality for those that are DID, and for those that are not, learning to live now without relying on dysfunctional coping skills. It also brings up relational issues and spiritual issues and closure in therapy, as we know that with trauma, people do and can get well. The heart model is a psychological spiritual model that was originally designed to be used in the resolution and healing from the effects of long-term complex trauma, usually brought on by early childhood sexual trauma, but it also works with domestic violence. And we have been experimenting with this model and doing research with trafficking survivors for the last 7 years, human trafficking survivors. And I hope I have enough time at the end of this just to talk a little bit about our findings in the research. The model is designed to address both cognitive thoughts, emotional feelings, the schemas that are connected to the traumatic events, and to deal with the sensory triggers by resolving internal conflict that includes, but is not limited to, that whole laundry list that's up on the board. In other words, it's designed to look at all the various stages and all the various things that we need to do when we're working with traumatized survivors. This is the dissociative continuum. It's based on Buddy Braun's work in the mid-'80s, but it shows borderline PTSD, dissociative disorder, and DID on a continuum that relates to the level of dissociation. This is a slide that illustrates what trauma does. Most of us have a narrative memory. Our narrative for the last few days have been the various things that we have been attending to, meetings that we've had with colleagues, spending time, at various meals, the things that we've been doing for a few days together. But we also have our life memory, right? And narrative. The narrative of where we went to school and sort of our job progression and who our friends are and how we've gotten along with our families and all the things that have happened in our life. But when trauma intrudes on that narrative memory, it's like a mask that literally goes over your face. And the person who's been traumatized sees everything from the viewpoint of looking through this mask. It stays with them. All the emotion and fear and the difficult emotion gets put off into what we call implicit memory, where it can't be accessed other than by being triggered. And clients go through all kinds of emotional and psychic protection to keep themselves from ever getting to that place of re-experiencing those emotions. I'll talk about that in just a little bit more in a few minutes. And the process of therapy literally is putting the narrative and the implicit memory back together so that it looks like a seamless narrative memory again. Now, I'm being a bit reductionistic here, but it is the work that we do, sometimes over years, to bring those two into congruence. Judith Herman wrote about it in her book on trauma recovery in 1992. And she says, I'm going to just read it to you. It says, repeated trauma in the adult life erodes the structure of the personality that's already formed. But repeated trauma in childhood forms and deforms the personality. The child is trapped in an abusive environment, is faced with a formidable task of adaptation. She must find a way to preserve a sense of trust in people who are untrustworthy, safety in a situation that is unsafe, control in a situation that is terrifyingly unpredictable, power in a situation of helplessness. Unable to care for or protect herself, she must compensate for the failures of adult care and protection with the only means at her disposal, an immature system of psychological defenses. And if you really think about it, it kind of wraps up what trauma survivors are having to deal with and cope with in order to come back, if you will, to congruence and to healing. So the secular part of the heart model that follows the three-phase process is this right here. We create a safe environment. Now, when we say safe environment, I'll get into that again. It's all of those things. It's the safety, it's the confidentiality, it's the therapeutic alliance. It's all the things that we normally do in the process of therapy to begin with. We connect somehow to the memory work. We anchor to that memory, and when we anchor to memory, it brings up what? Emotion. And so we've got to work with processing the emotion and processing the affect. And then the next stage of this is reconciling the cognitive dissonance, the cognitive distortion between the child of then and the adult of now, because that's the conflict. All the shame and the hurt and the embarrassment and the fear and the pain are all wrapped up in that interaction between who she is and wants to be now and who she was back then, helpless and not able to do anything. And the next stage of this has to do with somehow finding a way to forgive herself or himself. Somehow letting themselves off the hook, because that allows for the parts to come together, and hopefully with a way of sort of looking at life much differently. Now I'm going to take you through those stages, and then I'm going to add the overlay to this so that you can see how the process works. So let's talk about rapport and safety. What's rapport? Well, trust, honesty, good communication, being an active listener, solidifying that therapeutic alliance. Carl Rogers was right. 90% of the work is in the therapeutic alliance. Clients will follow you anywhere if you've got a solid therapeutic alliance, including your mistakes, as long as you're honest about your mistakes. I like to think that I've been doing this for a while. I don't make many mistakes. The reality is I make them every week. I say the wrong things. I go in the wrong direction. I'm not paying attention enough. I try to own it as much as I can. Safety. How safe is it to do counseling where you are? I can tell you that there are times when my office where I work is not safe. Why? Because there are people that walk out in front of my door and they sometimes have conversations, and that throws off the pacing sometimes of the counseling. There are times I've got to meet with clients in another location because of it. How safe physically, spiritually, emotionally is your location for counseling? Stabilization. We spend a lot of time in stabilizing current situations. Very often they don't come in for the trauma. They'll come in for difficulty in a relationship. They'll come in for depression. They'll come in for anything but working on what's underneath all of this having to do with the trauma. And yet, as that starts to become more and more part of what the interaction is, it starts to become more and more part of the therapy, and all of that starts to get refocused. Can they affect regulate? Can they relax themselves when things are overwhelming? What kind of structural abilities do they have in communication or assertion? Do they have the ability to say no to people around them? All capacity building skills necessary to do trauma work, long before you get into trauma work. So dealing with coping skills. The second stage of this is moving into phase 2, where we start to work with memory, anchoring to the memory. If you don't think memory is important, let me tell you, the Bible refers to remembrance 250 times. Think it's important? But it's kind of interesting because the biblical view of remembrance is very much like what happens in trauma. Because in trauma, the memory gets encoded, especially as a child, as whole chunks, feelings, smells, emotions, sensations, everything gets encoded into the brain, often in place of the implicit memory. So it's not accessible unless it's triggered out. The Bible says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Now, for most of us, that might mean making it to church on time, maybe to a Sunday school class. It might mean a family gathering. We have all kinds of different ways of looking at what remembering the Sabbath day. In biblical times, in Jewish tradition, remembering the Sabbath day was starting the day before. Cleaning the house, cooking all the food, pressing the clothes, laying it all out. In other words, smell, sights, tastes, all of our senses activated for the entire day to first remember God and then remember family. A little bit different than our understanding of it today. But that's what happens in trauma. It's all our senses. Sometimes memory is inaccessible, especially if the traumatic events occurred pre-verbal ages or before the child's brain had the capacity for narrative memory. And other memories were so overwhelming that they were either repressed or dissociated. If the amygdala of the brain is excessively activated, such as in highly traumatic situations, overwhelming or transmission of data to the hippocampus takes place, and the events get stored as isolated sensory imprints. Bessel van der Kolk, who is probably the top researcher in the area of PTSD in the country right now, calls this chronic dissociative amnesia. It's out of reach. So it's where all of the 90s angst about repressed memories and everything came about. It's this whole mechanism that happens with the brain. I'd love to spend the time to get into it, but I don't have it today. Let me define it for you. Frightening events, which are outside of ordinary human experience but cannot be organized on a linguistic level, but are instead assimilated directly as a somatosensory event and not integrated with other memories. In other words, these memories overwhelm the normal data processing mechanism of the brain. And so the brain is therefore unable to translate them into words, and they get stored separate from the narrative memory, just like raw data based on the 5 senses. By the way, Bessel van der Kolk's new book is titled The Body Keeps the Score. If you haven't read it and you work in trauma, I really recommend it to you because it talks about this whole process of what happens with the memory and how it encodes into the body. Stage 2, of course, is the feelings that come up with this. In discovering and healing our true self, we learn that there are many old rules and messages were just not true. We become more and more aware of that powerful part of us, our inner life. Its major component, our feelings, our emotions. I just came from a presentation where they talked about the thought process that activates to the feelings and how we act on. Very often it's the feelings that will dictate our actions. Also, if you go to the slides, by the way, that are online, you have a much broader, I had 90 slides, I had to redact them. I just didn't have enough time to get there. I'm sorry. So we've got our feelings, we've got our emotions, and now what we have to wrestle with, and this can take months, years sometimes, is wrestling with that inner part of ourselves. The adult of now, the child of then. Now, the way I go about this and the way I talk about this is in the form of basic chair work, Gestalt therapy chair work, without the inconvenience of actually using chairs. I do this through visualization. Inner child work is based on Gestalt method of chair work, often without the inconvenience, like I said, of using chairs. Each session is seen as an experiment, an existential encounter in which the therapist and client engage in a calculated risk-taking involving exploration of heretofore unknown or forbidden information, feelings, or territory. The technique is designed to resolve splits. A split represents a division of the self process into 2 partial aspects of the self. The technique is used to resolve the issues within the splits. The technique produces a more direct experience of the internal conflict and encourages the client in a form of self-confrontation that helps to create the resolution to the conflict. Now, what are we resolving? These are the cognitive distortions that we're resolving. Trauma survivors blame themselves. So victim responsibility becomes paramount. Somehow it became their fault that they were traumatized. I'm often amazed at my clients who talk to me about, oh, I was 6 years old and I came on to him. And I said, what? You came on, he was 40 years old. You came on to him? Well, yeah, I sat in his lap and I said, you were a child. That's what children do. Children want adult attention. Now, there are some techniques that I work with this particular one. Secrecy. A lot of times, you're the first person they're telling. You're the first person that they've trusted enough to tell what had happened to them in childhood. And they have kept this secrecy because even in adulthood, they believe somehow, sometimes even when the perpetrator is long gone and dead, that somehow from the grave they're going to be hurt, they're going to be blamed, somebody in the family is going to be hurt. Why? Because they were told by the perpetrator that somehow they would be. If they felt any sort of physical pleasure, which is normal for our bodies, or emotional pleasure, which is normal for children, they blame themselves. And God forbid they had an orgasm, because the shame gets multiplied, thinking, oh, I must have enjoyed it, I must have liked it. And the most difficult of all is that love-hate resolution between the perpetrator. I love him, but I hate him. He was my dad. He provided all these things for us, but he did all these horrible things. And they find all kinds of ways to exonerate the perpetrator. Difficult issues. And as you see, these issues come again when we talk about it from a spiritual framework. Forgiveness of self becomes essential. Finding a way to let themselves off the hook. Finding a way to resolve and find some compassion for that child who had to go through that horrible experience. What about forgiveness? The only necessity as far as healing is concerned is forgiving yourself. Developing compassion, forgiveness for an abuser or a member of the family who did not protect them is not required to heal. It's something to hope for or shoot for, but it's not the final goal. In fact, forgiving an abuser or perpetrator or non-protector becomes an artifact of good therapy. If you don't focus on it and you get someone to the place of being willing to let go, isn't that in essence forgiveness? That get willing to not hold on to any kind of repayment, any kind of recompense. Giving up repayment in any form is forgiveness. I use the king who forgives the 10 talents of money. Do you think he ever went into business with that guy again? Do you think it was sort of, oh, now that this is over with, we can do this again? Do you think he ever forgot? So it's not forgive and forget. It's not a rejoining of the relationship. It's a letting go of the repayment and moving on. It's a realignment, if you will, of our understanding of forgiveness. It allows for anger and does not pardon or excuse the abuser. Healing depends on forgiving yourself. It also will open you to God's forgiveness, as you'll see when we talk about the overlay. You must forgive yourself for limitations you've lived with as an adult, for your own victimization, for needing time to heal, for how you may have dealt with others, including children. This type of forgiveness is essential to the healing process. From a secular viewpoint, we then deal with bringing those merged parts together. And it's not new in psychology. Gestalt talked about it, parts that make up and complete the whole. Self-psychology, our true self. Transpersonal psychology, we connect to what's beyond ourself to truly experience our true self. We've got a lot of different ways of talking about it. We have had for quite some time. And lastly, when the parts are together, it's kind of reframing where we look and what we do. The merging of parts is a fusion of thoughts, ideas, abilities, emotions. Nothing is lost in the process, including when we're working with DID. Sometimes clients will need to grieve the loss of the separateness of other parts on even how we coped poorly. They may need to grieve any loss of connection, loss of childhood, loss of innocence. And they often have to work out the connection to the emotions that they have so long kept at bay. But it is a new way of looking at life. Now that's the secular part. So let's go back a little bit and add the steps for the overlay. The first 5 stages are all the same, but at stage 6, instead of moving to merging of parts, we introduce the awareness of God. Now, sometimes that's present all the way through. Sometimes it's just there. I'll talk about that in a moment. Dealing with receiving forgiveness from God. Opening to the gift that's already been given. And then in the merging of parts, having God being part of that process of actually coming together. That God is in the center of that. Most of us know about the triune self, mind, body, and spirit. It's actually the Greeks that did that for us, pulled it apart. It was later in the 17th century reiterated by René Descartes. But in Jewish tradition, mind, body, and spirit have always been in one place, and that's in the heart. That they are together. The Bible doesn't talk about trauma, it talks about infirmities. According to David Seamans, infirmities are unchosen factors or incomplete hurts, traumas, or weaknesses which tend to cripple or distort our functioning in some way. I really like this part of it. Bear with me just a little bit. I'll connect the next 3 or 4 slides. Childishness, in Greek, nepios. This is someone who is spiritually mature. When Paul said to the Romans to put away childish things, this was his implication. In Greek, put away means to render inoperative, inactive from, to free that from which has been keeping one bound or tied up. So maturity is not a function of age, but of action. And we're told, Paul says, put away childish things. To become what? To become childlike. The Greek word is paidion. It's where pediatrics comes from. It's the same word that Jesus used when he said, unless you become converted and become like children, you shall not enter the kingdom of heaven. Healthy child is teachable, humble, accepting, open to others, and has faith. And from the word paraclete, the one called to be alongside of, comes from the Greek word for help, to take hold of on the other side. Now here's the spiritual part that goes with this. Literally, we're asking the Holy Spirit to take hold of on the other side and pull them through and over. From childishness, keeping one bound, to childlikeness, to growth. We do that by introducing the concept of God, the awareness of God. And of course, it brings up all kinds of distortions of God. Same sort of cognitive distortions that we have with ourselves, we have spiritual distortions of God. I don't know about you, but I learned about God from Charlton Heston. I looked at that bush burning and I said, this was a God to be careful of. I was 8 years old, I remember it clearly. We all have distortions, different ways that we've seen God. We try to sometimes mold God into who we want God to be. And then we're angry at God when he doesn't come through. Technique we use for this is very simple. It's actually a Benedictine process of contemplative prayer. We simply say, and I invite you to try it out for a moment, to just simply close your eyes. And if we can agree that when 2 or more are gathered, God is present, and God dwells here right now with us, how do you experience the presence of God right now? Just pay attention to how you know that God is here. Is he close? Is he far away? If he's far away, can you move closer? Is that possible? Or are you somehow blocked from doing that? Notice how you're experiencing this. Is it a picture? Is it a sensation? Is it a feeling? Is it a thought? Now, in the course of the last 2 minutes, you can open your eyes. In the course of the last 2 minutes, notice that we stayed away from theology. We stayed away from doctrine. We focused on the relationship. Is God here? And if it's not, I inherently know that the person has things that are in the way of making that connection. So that becomes part of the focus of our dialogue and discussion. Sometimes they connect, sometimes they don't. But it also brings up all the distortions. And these are some that actually come from David Seamands. The demanding, domineering God. The underlying message here is that God's untrustworthy, only accepts me when I measure up. And rather than the nurturing parent, God is seen as critical or unpleasant. Or the legal God, constant ledger of wrongdoings. The gotcha God, the one that's waiting for things to fail, looking us to fall down. Or the God that's sitting off on a cloud somewhere. Or the philosopher God in the all knowledge at his disposal in his library. Or the Pharaoh God, who's seen as the unpleasant taskmaster. This can go on and on and on. We have all kinds of ways that we can conjure up our images of God. I worked with a client some years ago, and very angry at God. She was married to a pastor of a church, non-denominational church, gotten to the place where she couldn't even go to church with him, which of course put his job in jeopardy because that was a sort of an unspoken requirement. And it wasn't until we were in the middle of a session when she was having an abreaction, which is a reliving of the experience. And she said, "Oh my goodness, I see it." And I said, what is it that you see? She said, "Well, I've been telling you that my uncle had traumatized me over and over for a number of years. I think it only happened once." And I said, "Oh, so tell me more." And the way I dealt with this is that he was wearing a gold cross. And as he was raping me, I focused on that cross. And so God the Father became God the Father who raped me in that moment, which is where her anger toward God was all held. It's processing that. It's working through those issues to come to a place, hopefully, of healing. But dealing with God and God's forgiveness, sometimes we have to dare to forgive God for not being what we wanted him to be or doing what we wanted him to do. I've had a lot of conversations with someone who's become a friend in the last couple of years. Many of you know Paul Vitz. We talk about forgiveness a lot. And I thought the model was going to be in conflict with some of the things that he was teaching about self-forgiveness. You can't really forgive yourself, and that was his position. And in our dialogue, he said, well, it's probably not really good theology, but I understand that with trauma, sometimes you have to come to a place where they understand and connect to themselves, and I get it. It's then that they can transcend that afterwards, after they come to a place of wholeness. And I said, you're right. We have to work within the framework of our clients and work within the framework of a place that they can come to heal. Now, I brought this particular thing up here at Divine Mercy, and of course in other colleges as well, and places that I've presented this. And I will always get someone that says, well, what do you mean we forgive God? I said, I think the God I know can handle that. We've got to give up our illusion of who God is. The box is too small. And that's true for most of us. The resolution of spiritual cognitive distortions leaves the same issues of forgiveness that are implied with the forgiveness of self. God's given us the gift of forgiveness. It's kind of like a birthday present. If I give you a birthday present and it's all wrapped up really nice and you put it in the trunk of your car, I've given you the present, but it's absolutely useless to you until you take it out of the trunk of the car, unwrap the box, and take it out of the box. And that's what's going on here. It's given to us, but we've got to learn to appropriate it. We've got to learn to take it on. And so the merging of the split parts starts to take on an entirely different focus with the spiritual overlay. At the point of welcoming unity with God, we declare that there's no division or separation. Dichotomies have been synthesized, and an awareness of our interconnectedness is starting to become clear. In this state, sometimes referred to as bliss, we experience joy, peace. We become transformed in that process. But there's a whole litany of issues that need to be resolved. And the issues that can come up in the process of this is dealing with the character of God, the nature of evil. Why does God allow abuse? As a therapist, you need to be prepared for that question. If God's so powerful, why didn't he stop this? Why didn't he do something different? And you've got to be able to work with the ambiguity that they have had for all these years, and not with just a simple answer or even a reflective scriptural answer, because they have to come to a way of understanding it for themselves. And that gets back to the dialogue, the simple dialogue that was created back in the sixth stage of this, of talking with God. It's in the relationship. If I can get them to really be in a place where God is present with them, I can then begin the same kind of dialogue I did with the child. And it's the same process. I have never worked with this that God has not shown up one way or the other. And it's not something that all of a sudden everything is wonderful. This process can take months, sometimes years. That's why I said this is not a linear process, it's a circular process. Because I can be working on this one day and the next day we're dealing with another memory. So we're back to stage 2. Or they're dealing with whether they can trust me or not because I said something the last time, and we're back to stage 1. All the feelings of anger and love and hate and forgiveness and self-identity, and how does the demonic influence come into this? All filter in the process of looking at how God fits into the picture, and may come up in the process of this. Stage 9 deals with the infilling of God. We invite God into the process of the merger. That it's not 2 parts coming together, it's 3 coming together. Secularly, if you read the literature, especially with DID clients, you'll know that there are times when the process unravels, comes apart. The parts of self don't stay together. There are a number of reasons for that I don't have time to get into. I can tell you in working with this anecdotally, I can tell you that spiritually I've never seen it unravel. And I've been doing this since the mid-'80s. But returning with new insight in life also has a change with this overlay. A healing spirituality is the opposite of alienation. It's a passion for life. It's a feeling with connection of being a part of life. One of the things that comes up with almost every sexual trauma survivor is that if this doesn't work out, I will commit suicide and it'll be over with. Every one of them holds on to that as the ultimate way out. This becomes the ultimate way back in. It's a coping mechanism. Be careful about taking it away too soon. There's a part of every living thing that wants to become itself. The tadpole into a frog, the chrysalis into a butterfly, a damaged human being into a whole one. Spirituality is not only our connection to God, but the choosing to heal, to be healthy, to be fully alive. It's becoming your whole and true self. A reformed life with new insight involves having clarity, staying centered to see and know what's essential and to let other things fall away. Spirituality and the following of that inner voice of God's Holy Spirit is a connection to the deepest source of love and the guide through. So that's the model in its entirety. Yes, it was a little reductionistic. We actually do a 2-day training on this where we go through each of these and sort of talk about the methodologies to get the results. But we have been, I have a few minutes that and then I'll open this for questions. We have been, over the last 7 years, testing this with survivors of human trafficking. You might say, why human trafficking? Because every victim of human trafficking is either PTSD, dissociative, borderline, or DID. 100%. And these were the places that were involved in our study: Samaritan Women in Baltimore, that should be Courage House International in Rockland, California, Wellspring International in Atlanta, Georgia, Redeemer Ministries and Freedom Place in Houston, and Phoenix Center in Arizona started with us, didn't complete because they closed their program, and we aligned with Letitia's House in Williamsburg, Virginia, to complete what we needed for our sample. Currently, there are no faith-based models that are best practices for trauma work. There are no faith-based models that parallel the secular model of treatment. And the heart model will be the first treatment model that becomes established as a best practice with sufficient research. Hope for Justice funded the research project, and they will end up becoming the agency credited. Preliminary findings. What we did was we went in and we trained the clinical staff of all of these centers on the heart model. And then we would give the participants assessments at key points along the way up to 2 years. We found that it increases, that volunteer and staff training increased trauma-informed care, coping skills, and burnout among staff decreased. There was a decrease in negative emotion and decrease in post-traumatic symptoms, depression, anxiety, symptoms of PTSD. Education and assessment seemed to improve self-esteem, and residential placement, particularly with adolescents, fostered change. The research itself, over the research time with both adults and adolescents, showed a decrease in all symptoms of PTSD, decrease in depression, anxiety, an increase in personal resiliency, and an increase in positive God image.
Someone who's used media a lot in evangelization, so I believe in the importance of Catholic radio, Catholic TV, Catholics using the new media. Can I encourage everyone to watch Shalom TV? I think it's a great vehicle of evangelization. And God bless all of you.
Shalom World, God's own channel.